Today's daf is daf Mem Dalid, and there's a piece here from Zeiri to explain a brisa, and that's really a piece that belongs to yesterday's discussion. We'll try to fill it in just for the sake of completion, but really today's sugya begins approximately 15 lines down from the top with Tana Rabbanan after the two dots. But let's see if we could fill in a little bit about Zeiri. And Zeiri was complimented as the individual who knows how to interpret a brisa that's very ambiguous. And in this case, it has to do with a brisa that speaks about chamuros and kalos, which can be understood in two different directions. It could be that kalos and chamuros is a reference to the object that's being contaminated, where kalos would be maser sheni and chamuros would be kodshim or truma, because the violation of being metame maser sheni incurs only malchus. It's a basic common lav, whereas if someone is metame truma or kodshim, that incurs a chiv of misa b'dei shamayim. So that makes truma more chamur. And the other direction to explain kalos and chamuros is in terms of the tuma that was contracted by the person who is being metame, either the maser sheni or the truma. And the different levels of tuma are reflected in the tuma sheretz, which is a tuma just of one day. And even on that day, he could go to mikvah. He doesn't have to bother with anything else. Whereas there's tumas mes, if a person comes in contact with a corpse, and then he has to wait 7 full days, and he becomes at least an avatuma, and he could be metame kalim and odom. So that makes the tuma of mes relative to the tuma of sheretz a tuma chamura. So what Zeiri is going to do now, in order to explain this brisa, and the brisa is trying to justify why the Torah had to indicate the prohibition, the violation of tuma in both kalos and chamuros. So Zeiri is going to combine these two interpretations of kalos and chamuros, and he's going to come to the conclusion, based on logic, that a chamura and a kala would be the same as a kala and a chamura, meaning that you could understand it in both directions. So let's just read it inside. Omar Zeiri kalos, the word kalos here refers to Tumas Sheretz, which, as we said, that's a relatively light tuma that was contracted by contact with the sheretz, and chamuris is tumas mes. As we said, if you have contact a maga with a mes, then you're tomei shivas yomim. V'hachi kamar. Now Zeiri, having laid the framework and the rules, he's going to now plug this in to interpret the brisa. Hachi kamar. Ilu nemar tumas sheretz. V'nemar tuma maser utruma. Now, in the case of tuma sheretz, as we said, we're talking about kalos. And if the Torah would have indicated that the punishment for someone who contracted tumas sheretz hakala and now comes in contact with either maser sheni or with truma, and there's a fundamental difference between the two, because if he comes in contact with maser, then he only violates a lav, whereas if he comes in contact with truma and he's metame truma, he's chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. V'lo nemra tumas mes. if the Torah had completely omitted the chumrah, the chamura, meaning the high level, intense level of tumas mes, hayisi omer, I would have come to the mistaken conclusion that kalos, meaning if he contracted tuma with through contact with a sheretz, then ala kalos bilav, right? If he comes in contact with maser, which we said was kal, then he violates a lav. He's chayiv malchus, but he's not chayiv misa b'dei shamayim. But v'ala chamuras b'misa, if he who contracted a tuma kala, namely through sheretz, would now come in contact with a truma, which we said that truma relative to maser sheni is a chumra, is a chamura. Why is it a chamura? Because the violation of truma engenders a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim, whereas the violation of tumas maser sheni only violates a lav and malchus. Umida kalos ala chamuros b'misa. Now here we get to the chap, the vitz of Zeiri, that if in the case of kalos, which Zeiri understood to mean the tuma kala of sheretz, when he comes in contact with chamuros and he's mitame truma, chamuros name ala kalos b'misa, then let's flip it around the other direction. In the case of someone who contracted tumah by contact with a mess, and therefore he's in a very severe, stringent state of tumah that requires shivas yomim, and now he's mitame maser sheni, then I would have thought that he would now be chayav misa. Because just like in the case of a tuma kala that it comes in contact with truma, he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim. So too, if I flip it around and I talk about a tuma chamura and the nitma, the thing that the object, the victim of his tuma was kala, namely it was maser sheni, likewise there should be a chayav misa b'dei shamayim. And therefore the Torah had to go out of its way, says the Brisa, according to Ziri's interpretation, to teach us that even if he's Tameh B'Tumah Chamura and he comes in contact with Kala, which means Maser, nevertheless, he's only Chayav Malchus and he's not Chayav Misa. So the Torah mentions Tumas Mes, and we ask the question, why did the Torah have to bother with Tumas Mes, which is a Tumah Chamura, in order to explicate that if someone who's nitma b'tumah chamura comes in contact with maser, which is kal, he's only going to be chayav malchus. And I would have had the havmina says that he should be chayav misa b'dei shamayim, just like the case of someone who is nitba b'sheretz, who now comes in contact with truma, so that you have kala in terms of the nature of the tumah, and chamur in terms of the object that's being contaminated. So too, I would have thought, and in that case, if he was tamei tumah sheretz and he came in contact with truma, he's going to be chayav misa b'dei shamayim because it's chamura. Truma is chamura. So too, I would have come to the same conclusion about a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim in a case of somebody who contracted tumah chamura of tumas mes and came in contact with kala with maser sheni, which is relatively kal. And the truth is that in such a case, he's only chayiv malchus. So that's why the Torah had to specify the case of tumah chamura. Okay, now we start our sugya for today. The Mishnah says, Kol sheyesh lo matirin. So I just want to make sure we're all in the same place. We're going to count down from the top of the Yomid. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. 10 lines down from the top. And first, the printed text of Agamora reprints the segment of the Mishnah that we're going to be dealing with. So a machshavas pigul could work in two directions, either chutz l'zmano on the achilas adam, or chutz l'zmano on the achilas mizbeach, meaning that the haktoras emurim in his intention would take place tomorrow, after the allotted time. In both these cases, pigul is chal. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, O eino mevi ela kayotze bishlamim. Now, we have to understand one thing. The parsha of Pigul, and we've seen this before, is in the parsha of Shlomim. And therefore, it's not coincidental. There must be a reason why Shlomim becomes the paradigm for Pigul. We're going to have to see in what's called a klal, prat uklal, that we're going to derive the rules and the limitations of Pigul from Shlomim. Shlomim becomes the paradigm. Right now, since we're limited in the scope of Pigul by Shlomim, and Shlomim has an Achila today, tonight, and tomorrow, 2 days and 1 night, then we can only derive Pigul with regard to another carbon. We'll soon see that the carbon of Bechar fits that bill, and it has 2 days and 1 night. But Nechal Liyom V'Layla Minayin, how do I know that Pigul applies even to, let's say, a carbon Chatos, which is Nechal only today and tonight, but not tomorrow? Talmud Loma Mibsar. So this pasuk is in Vayikra Perek Zayin, and there's an extra word. It says Hechol Yachel Mibsar Zevach Shlomiv. Why did the Torah feel compelled to add the word Bivsar? It's apparently some sort of a ribui in the parsha of Pigul. Kol Shesh Yorav Necholim, meaning any carbon where it has shirayim, and those shirayim are eaten, even if they're eaten in less than a period of time of 2 days and 1 night, they are included under Pigul. And therefore, we're going to expand the application of Pigul to the case of a carbon chatas or a carbon osham. But we still don't have a source to prove that Pigul applies to a carbon ola, because in the case of a carbon ola, we don't have shiyareha necholim. It's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. Is ola she'ein shiyareha nechol minayin tamalomer zevach. Again, in the pasuk, if we go back to the pasuk, it says mibsar zevach shlama. The word zevach, like the word basar, is completely superfluous. So what's it coming to be marbe? It's being marbe any sort of zevach. Every carbon is included under Pigul. But again, the word zevach means shchita. So that extends and includes only animals. It does not extend to birds. And therefore, minayin l'rabos ha'ofos, ofos have malika as a substitute for zvicha, for shchita, and menachos bichlal don't have any zvicha at all. Not even a substitute zvicha like malika in the case of ofos. So how do we know that the parsha and the chalosh shem pigul will apply to ofos? Ofos means either chatas ha'of or olas ha'of, and menachos, we had a whole list of enumerated list of menachos. Now, let's extend that question. Number one, we don't know of the source for Pigul in Ophos and Menachos. And number two, Ad Shani Marba Log Shemen Shel Mitzorah. What about Shemen, which is brought by a Mitzorah in the process of his purification? And that Shemen of the Mitzorah, number one, will have Hazah al Gabi Mizbeach, Mizbeach HaChitzon, and number two, there will be a placement of the Shemen on the thumb and the big right toe of the Mitzorah, and that Hazoya plus Matana or Nesina will be matir the shiore halog, the remnants of the shemen for the kohen. How do we know that if at the time that they were makriv the carbon osham, which is accompanied by the log shemen, he had a machshava of chutz lizmano, that the chal Hashem pigel with the chi of kares is chal on the log shemen. Talmud Lomar, and that we derive from the pasuk that says asher hem makdishim li. Okay. This pasuk, as opposed to the previous pasuk in Vayikra Zayin, is in Vayikra Chav Beis, and I believe this has to do with Yimei HaMiluim. Let me just double check that. 1 second. Vayikra Chav Beis. No. Taber al Aaron v'elbono v'nozru mikodshe b'nei Yisrael v'lo yechalu Hashem kodshei asher hem makdishin ani Hashem. In any event, we'll have to, if we have time, open up the pasuk and see it in context. Here he points out that the context is eating Kodshe Hashem while you're tameh, and the pasuk says Asher Heim Makdishim Li, which is an all-inclusive phrase, and every single type of carbon is included. And we're assuming now that the log shemen of the mitzvah is also a type of carbon because it's subject, as we said before, to hazoya al gabi mizbeach, not just on the goof of the mitzvah. And certainly it goes without saying that the ophos and the menachos certainly come under that which is sacrificed and is brought on the mizbeach. Okay, now we have a couple of Gzeres Shavas here. V'asi nosar chilul chilul mituma. We have a Gzeres Shav of chilul chilul with regard to nosar. V'asi pigul avon avon minosar. So we have now first a derivation from nosar, from tuma to nosar, and then we have from nosar to pigul. And if we put together these two Gzeres Shavas and the commonality between Nosar and Pigul is Avon Avon, so we're going to derive the conclusion that just like with regard to Tumah, so too with regard to Nosar and Pigul, we're going to apply these prohibitions and these psulim with their accompanying punishments if you violate them to all karbanos. So the Gemara says, "Umeacher shesofo." We're back to the brisa. Shesofo l'rabos kol dover lama nema shlomim me'achta. So why did the Torah place the parsha of Pigul in Shlomim when Pigul applies to all karbanos? And the answer is Lomar Lecha, to teach us that Mashlom Yuchanim Shei Matirim Bein Ba'adam Bein L'Mizbech Afkol Sheish Matirim Bein Li'adam Bein L'Mizbech Hayoven LeMishum Pigul. Shlomim is the only carbon that combines Achilas Adam with Achilas Mizbeach. Although it's true that Achatas also has that combination, but In the case of chatas, it's only nechal lezichrei kahuna. So the expanded consumption of human beings applies to shlomim. Certainly, with regard to shlomim, we have achilas mizbeach, where the avarim and the emurim are nikrovim al gabi mizbeach, and therefore there's a chiyuv pigul. So 1 second. So what are we excluding here? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Just 1 second. Oh, I got it. Yeah. You see, if the Torah had not written Pigul in the Parsha of Shlomim, I would not know that Pigul in the Machshav of Chutzes Mano applies even to Achilas Mizbeach, and therefore I would not be able to derive Pigul in Ola, because Ola has no Achilas Adam, it only has Achilas Mizbeach. But once we know that in Shlomim, which has Achilas Mizbeach, there is Pigul, so too in Ola, which has Achilas Mizbeach, there is Pigul. I think, let me see if anybody points this out. So what would be a case where there's Achilas Adam without Achilas Mizbeach? It can't be Log Shemen, because Log Shemen has Achilas Mizbeach. What would be the case? Just 1 second. It's coming through slowly. Let's say in a case of Shiori Mincha. That's not a good example because the Kmitza and the Levona are al gabi Mizbeach, so Achilas Mizbeach. And what about Nesachim? Nesachim is purely Achilas Mizbeach. Okay, Rebel. So I don't. Right now, it's not registering. Maybe you could help me out here. What would be a case where there's Achilas Adam without Achilas Mizbeach, so that we have to learn Pigul from Shlomim in that case? Okay, we'll have to figure that out. Okay, where are we up to now? Oh, now Ha'olah. So Ola is Dava Matir Besar Mizbeach, right? Once you have the Zrikas Hadam of the Korban Ola, then you could bring everything, the entire animal, on the Mizbeach. The Oral Kohanim, okay, fine. That's a separate din that the hides of a Korban Ola are given to the Kohanim. Olas ha'of doma matis b'sora l'mizbeach. Chatas ha'of doma matis b'sora l'kohanim. Yeah, but chatas ha'of also is matir imurim l'mizbeach. Parma nisrafim u'seirim nisrafim doma matis imurim l'korev. So far I don't see where the Gemara spelled out a case where there's Achilas Adam without Achilas Mizbeach. So that eludes me at this point. And now the Brisa excludes cases where there is no Pigul, because if it's a Nitar, there's Pigul, but if it's only a Matir and there's no Nitar, there's no Pigul. Therefore, Motzi Ani I exclude Es HaKometz, Es HaLevona, Vaktoris, Uminchas Kodim, Minchas Kodim, Mishich, Uminchas Esochim Adam, because in all those cases, as we said before, there's only a Matir, but not a Nitar. So when the let's say the Kohen has a Machshavas Chutzes Mano regarding a Kometz, the Kometz itself, although it's possible, is not subject to the Chiyuv Kares on the Pigul, because the essence or the definition of kometz is to be matir, but it's not a nitar. Basically, you could say it's matir itself. Okay, now we go back to the brisa that introduces a dissenting opinion of Reb Shimon, who is going to limit the application of pigul based on shlomim. And Reb Shimon Omer, Ma shlom yuchanim sheyesh bo al mizbeach achitza chayovim olav, af kol sheyesh no al mizbeach achitza chayovim olav mishum pigul, yotzu par man isrofim, sor man isrofim, ol ve'ein al mizbeach achitza kishlomim, meaning that with regard to parim and isrofim, so mimanavshach, there's nothing on the mizbeach achitza, mimanavshach. Why? Because that which requires matana and haktara is on the mizbeach hapnimi, because we're talking about parim and isrofim, and the basar itself is burnt to a crisp outside, Yerushalayim, wherever it is. It's therefore in chayav and alav mishum pigul. So the machlokas now between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon about the extent of the application of pigul that we derive from shlomim will have the following nafkamina. Number one, parim nisrafim. Number two, seirim nisrafim, where there's no avoda on the mizbeach achitza, and therefore it's not similar to shlomim, where all the avoda, the four avodos and the zrikas adam is on the mizbeach achitza. Omar mar kayotzu b'shlomim. So let's go back to the beginning of the brisa. And the brisa said that we would not know chatos and so forth and so on without a special ribui of asher hei makdishim li, because we are limited to a comparison to shlomim that's nechal l'shnei yom v'lay lechad. So the Gemara asks, what other case would there be where pigul would apply based on a comparison to shlomim, which is nechal l'shnei yom v'lay lechas? Bechor, the nechal l'shnei yom v'lay lechad. B'may osi, so how are you going to derive bechor from shlomim? So Gemara says, "Viva mematzinu," right? That just like we found pigul in the case of shlomim, which is nechal l'shnei yom v'laylacha, so too there's pigul by virtue of a comparison, which is called the vabe matzinu in the case of bechor. So now you're telling me that bechor equals shlomim. That's not so. There are chumras 3 in number that apply to shlom that don't apply to bechor, and therefore, since the Torah is in general more machmir in shlomim than in bechor, I would not be able to utilize the method of Habem Atzinu to extend pigul to apply to bechor, because malish shlomim, number one, shem to unim smicha. There's no smicha by bechor. Number two, like any other korban except for bechor, and maybe maaser, maaser beim, I mean, it's accompanied by nisachim. Bechor is not accompanied by nisachim. Utnufas chaz v'shok. And none of these apply to a bechor. Ella, we're going to have another pasuk. It's not going to be sufficient to derive it from V'mematzinu. Me'im he'achol ye'achel. Okay, so this is a pasuk in Vayikra Zayin. V'im he'achol ye'achel b'bsar zevach shloma bayom hashlishi. And why the double language? There must be a ribui here, and that ribui is going to give us bechor. Why bechor? Because bechor on the one hand is very similar to shlom v'nechal l'shnei yom v'laylachas, and I need a ribui of imhachol yachel to include pigul in the case of bechor, because bechor doesn't have smicha, doesn't have nesachim, it doesn't have It doesn't have tnufas chazav v'shog. Fact the Gemara, hani trei kloli desmichi adodininu. You're creating a klal pratu klal. You have a technical foul here, as we say in basketball, because klal has to be followed by a prat, and the prat by a klal. Here it's not so. Here the two klolim are next to each other, contiguous, and then we get the prat. Omaravina kida amri b'marova kol makush hatamotzi shnei klolim asmuchim zelazeh hatel prat beineim vidanim beklal prat. So the Marova back in Eretz Yisrael, they had a principle that if you have two klolim and then a prat, you take the prat and you insert it between the two klolim. Now the Brisa says, Ad shani mar belog shemen shel mitzora ha-mani Rabbi Meir. Wait a second. What's the matir of the log shemen of mitzora? It's going to be the avoda of the carbon asham, which is accompanied by the log shemen. So we could divide up the shiari halog to the kohanim because of the shchita of the carbon asham. There's only one problem. It's not true that the shchita of the carbon asham is matir the log shemen, because the log shemen could be brought 10 days later. But we're going to have to introduce the shita Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir makes the following distinction. In event that the log shemen was brought 10 days later, enochinami, there's no machsheves pigul at the time of the shchita of the carbon asham that would implode or impact a chalos pigul on the log. But if he chooses this mitzora to bring the carbon asham and the log shemen on the same day, the sanya log shemen shel mitzora chayav lo mishum pigul Divi Rabbi Meir, because he brought the log shemen together with the asham, and therefore the avodas ha'asham is matir the lug shemen, the shiori alug to the kohanim, and the Rabbanan reject it. Rabbanan say it doesn't matter whether he brought the we discussed this yesterday, whether he brought the carbon asham and the log shemen simultaneously on the same day. It's irrelevant. The very fact that the halacha allows him to bring the log shemen 10 days later means that there's no matir of the carbon asham vis-a-vis the log shemen. So the Gemara says, okay, you're telling me that this brisa is attributed to Rabbi Meir, but a Seifa, I'm going to prove to you that the Seifa has to reflect the sheet of the Rabbanon. Because motzi ani minchas nesochim v'adam ason l'Rabbanon. How do I know that in the case of minchas nesochim or dam, we are reflecting in this brisa the sheet of the Rabbanon against Rabbi Meir? This Sanya we learned in a brisa that niskei behema chayoven olea mishum pigul. So what happens here? Again, as we discussed either yesterday or 2 days ago, to remember, there are two types of niskei yain. There's niskei yain that are that accompany a carbon. Every carbon needs its niskei yain. And then there's niskei yain that come bifnei atzmam in a case where he, let's say, takes upon himself an adava, a promise, a voluntary pledge to bring nesachim. So now Rabbi Meir holds that in event that the niskei yayin are brought together with the carbon, then the niskei yayin in pigul are included in the avodas hakarbon, because the avodas hakarbon is matir the niskei yayin, and therefore chayav nolem mishum pigul, because he brought the niskei yayin to accompany the carbon, the zevach. V'nei shedama zevach matir l'karbon. Rabbi Meir. Amru Chacham rejected it. Halo Adam Mevi es Zevachim Hayom Nesachim Mikami es Yom. The Nesachim don't have to come together simultaneously on the same day with the carbon Zevach. He can bring the Nesachim 10 days later. So therefore, it definitely the Zrikas Adam of the carbon is not going to be matir the Nesachim. Omalahem, Rabbi Meir responds, I didn't mean that as a universal, absolute rule, the Zevach is matir the Nesachim. I'm only talking about a case where he chose to bring the Nesachim together with the Zevach. But in any event, we see now that the Brisa here in the Sefer reflects the Shita of the Chachamim, because the Shita of the Chachamim is that Motzi Ani Minchas Nisachim, that's excluded from Pigul. So it comes out that there's a very strange structure here in the Brisa, in which the beginning of the Brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Meir, and the Sefer, the end of the Brisa reflects Shita Rabbanan. Omer Rav Yosef, Ha'mani Rebbe. The author of the Brisa is Rebbe. The Omar, Rebbe's of the opinion that Log Shemen Shel Mitzora, Matnosov Shorule. Now, as we said before, with regard to the Log Shemen the Mitzora at the end of his Taras, what happens is that he's going to be mitayr himself for Tumas Taras through the matanos of the Log Shemen on the Mizbeach. And those matanos are going to be matir the shiore ha-shemen, shiore alot. And therefore, says Rebbe, umid matnosav sharule, matnosav mefaglile. If he has a machsheves pigul at the time that he does the hazoya of the log shemen on the mizbeach, and he has in mind chutz l'zmano, that's going to be mefagil the log shemen. Why? Because this, according to Rebbe, these applications of the lug shemen, I'm sorry, the applications of the carbon asham. No. Sorry. I had it right from the beginning. The applications of the log shemen on the mizbeach are matir the shirayim of the log, and therefore they're included in the Isur Pigul. Tisanya. We learned in the Brisa, log shemen shel mitzora molim bo ad sheyizro kadam. So again, as far as me'ila is concerned, if you misappropriate the oil and you use it for your own purposes, then that Isur me'ila, which generates a carbon me'ila, and you have to pay Kemer Chomesh, all those dinim apply up until the point of Nizar Kadam. Now, according to the Torah law, once the Zrikas Adam was implemented, there is no Me'ila, because Zrikas Adam is the key of mitzvaso, and that removes the Isur Me'ila. But again, we're seeing a connection here between the Dam and the Log Shemen. However, after the Zrika, the Rabbanan instituted an Isur Me'ila, which is called Lo Nenim V'Lo Molim. Now, it's on a Deraisa level, it doesn't constitute Me'ila, but in Rabbanan, you're not allowed to have Hanoah from it. However, Rebbe Omer, Molim Achiyite Matnosov, that the Torah recognizes the Isur Me'ila even after the Zrikas Adam of the Korban Asham, up until the time that he puts the Log Shemen, or part of the Log Shemen, I should say, on the Mizbeach, which is called Matnosov. V'shavin she'asav achila ad she'itei matan sheva u'matan bahonos. Even the Rabbanan agree to Rebbe that there is an Isur Achila, which is only the Rabbanon, until, according to the Tanakama, until he completes all the matanos. Now, including the matanos, you'll see he's got two. He's got matan sheva, which means the sheva hazos of the whatchamacallit, the log shemen, in the direction of the paroches, and he's got matan bahomos on the thumb and the big toe on the right side of the mitzvah. Amrua Kamed Rav Yirmiyah, they told over Rav Yosef's understanding of the Brisa to Rav Yirmiyah. Omar, he said, Gavra Rabbak Rav Yosef Lemiki Hai Milsa, could somebody as great as Rav Yosef say such a thing? It doesn't make any sense, as we'll soon see.